out there. Yeah, that was great. Yeah, that was great.
And doing you guys good. Good evening, everyone, and thank you all for coming. My name is Bernard Fajardo, and I'm a bookseller here at Politics and Prose. On behalf of the owners and of the staff, I would like to welcome all of you to your favorite bookstore for this evening's event. As you may already know, Politics and Prose have gone back to hosting in-person events along with our virtual book events, partnered events, trips and classes, so please check our website for a full list. And a little bit of housekeeping before we start. For the Q&A, please remember to step up to the microphone by the pillar over here. Before asking your questions, we can not only hear and enjoy the conversation, but also ensure that it is going to be recorded. For those of you who want to buy copies of the book, we are selling them behind the cash registers out front. We will be doing a signing after the Q&A, so if you would like to get your book signed, just fall in line by the pillar. And lastly, once the event is complete, we ask that you fold up your chairs, lean them against something sturdy to help us out a bit. Oh, and please silence your cell phones. This is going to be an amazing event with amazing conversation and Q&A, so you don't want your phone to be the one that will disturb the atmosphere. I am honored to introduce Mark Pomerantz to all of you. Mark received a BA from Harvard College and a JD from the University of Michigan Law School. He worked as a federal prosecutor in the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York. He has also been on the faculty of Columbia Law School and has lectured on criminal procedure and white-collar law at Harvard and Stanford Law Schools. And from February 2021 to February 2022, he worked pro bono as Special Assistant District Attorney in the Office of the New York District Attorney Cyrus Vance Jr. to assist with that office's criminal investigation into the personal and business finances of former President Donald Trump. This evening, he will talk about his new book, The People versus Donald Trump. In this riveting work of nonfiction, Pomerantz tells the story of his unprecedented investigation, why he believes Donald Trump should be prosecuted, and what we can learn about the nature of justice in America from this extraordinary case. Mark will be in conversation with Robert Costa. Robert is the chief election and campaign correspondent for CBS News, where he covers national politics and American democracy. So everyone, let us welcome Mark Pomerantz and Robert Costa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
It's great to be here. Thanks very much to Politics and Prose for hosting this conversation, to the C-SPAN audience, and to everyone in the neighborhood who stopped by. And Mark, thank you for being here to discuss your new book, a very in-depth look at this investigation, an ongoing investigation of former President Donald Trump. But before we dig into that investigation that you participated in, were a leader in, take me through your journey briefly from University of Michigan Law School to that call in December of 2020 to come aboard the Manhattan DA office.
I'll try and confine that story to, there were a lot of stops along the way. After graduating law school, I clerked for federal district judge Edward Weinfeld in New York City, went on to be a law clerk for Potter Stewart at the United States Supreme Court, and after that became an assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York. I served there for 4 years and then left as chief of appeals. I taught for a few years at Columbia Law School, then started a small criminal defense boutique with a lawyer named Ron Fischetti, and as things turned out, Ron became the personal attorney to Donald J. Trump and was representing Trump and was asked to represent Trump shortly after I was asked to participate in the investigation of Donald Trump. And since we'd been law partners for a number of years, it was an odd set of circumstances. In any event, after practicing in a small criminal defense boutique, I turned to practice in large law firms, but went back to the U.S. Attorney's Office for a few years as chief of the criminal division in the Southern District of New York. Then continued to practice essentially white-collar criminal defense, handling investigations, representing individuals and entities until I basically retired at the end of 2012. I was fairly young, but I didn't want to sit in conference rooms anymore without the sun and listening to questions that were not elegantly answered by my client and not elegantly put by the government. So I decided to retire, and I was retired when I got the call to start working on the
It was one of those
investigation.
Michael Corleone moments. You think you're out, then you get pulled back in. But why were you pulled back in? I know you explain a lot of this in the book, but for those of us who are just maybe starting to read it or you're just finishing it, help us understand why a former federal prosecutor is brought on by a Manhattan DA's office to investigate violations of state law.
Well, I think, first of all, I can't say for sure because I didn't ask that question. You know, I didn't protest when I got the call. I thought this is about the most interesting work one can do. And if somebody wanted me to help, I thought I might be able to help, and I was delighted to do it. I had a long background handling financial crimes on both sides as a prosecutor and defense lawyer. I had handled organized crime cases both as a prosecutor and as a defense attorney. And I am only assuming that that combination of background and experience was attractive to Cy Vance. And, but again, I didn't cross-examine him when he asked. I was absolutely delighted to work.
So you come into the Manhattan District Attorney's office, working with Cy Vance, working with other attorneys, and you're looking at the Trump organization. You're looking at how Trump has articulated his financial profile in recent decades. Tell me about one of the main characters there, someone I would spot over the years when I would go up to Trump Tower to report on then Mr. Trump, Alan Weisselberg.
Alan Weisselberg, we knew from the work that had been done and the reporting that had been done, was Donald Trump's right-hand man. You saw him as kind of a brooding omnipresence in many of the photographs of Donald Trump. We knew he had worked not only for Donald Trump for decades, but had worked for Trump's father, Fred Trump, for a long time. It was clear from the investigation that had been done that Weisselberg knew he was the money guy in the organization. To the extent there were financial crimes that we were investigating, Weisselberg would have to know about them. It's not a huge organization. It is run by a small group of trusted employees, many of whom had been with Trump for decades. Weisselberg perhaps being one of the oldest, most longstanding employees. And so as we started looking at crimes involving the financial control system of the company, the financial statements, what expenses were paid, how they were documented, Alan Weisselberg had designed the accounting system. Everybody in the accounting system reported up to him, and it was obvious that he was going to be somebody whom, if he could be induced to cooperate, would be a source of a lot of information. And
When you step back and look at all the ongoing investigations of former President Trump, there's the January 6th committee. There's the ongoing grand jury Justice Department investigations of January 6th, and so many others, the New York State investigation. But in the Manhattan DA's office, let's zoom in on your part of this. What were you looking for? As you said, this was a small company, a family company in many ways. It's not like investigating Google or Microsoft or Pfizer. It's a small company. And so what were the challenges in that endeavor from the start when you come into the office?
well, the challenges and the reason it was difficult came from there were a number of different reasons. One is unlike a large company like a Google or a Pfizer, the Trump organization did not cooperate with a law enforcement investigation at all, ever. There were no documents that were supplied on a voluntary basis. If you wanted something, it had to be dragged out of the company. If you wanted to speak to a company employee, they weren't brought in whether they had any criminal exposure or not. They had to be subpoenaed into a grand jury. And so at every step along the way, just the gathering of information was difficult. And indeed, it took 18 months. This was before I joined the investigation. But it took 18 months and 2 trips to the United States Supreme Court to get Donald Trump's tax returns and basic accounting information. And so just getting the information, the documentary information, was difficult. And it was clear that within the Trump organization, Donald Trump ran the organization with an iron hand. And people were not going to cooperate without his blessing, and he wasn't going to give his blessing. So it was a circumstance where every fact had to be kind of dragged out.
Years ago, right before Trump announced his 2016 campaign, I was writing for the Washington Post, and Trump came to the Post, and he had a 2-page document about his finances, and it was not a formal document in any way. And I remember he tossed it across the table at me, and I said to him, "How do you know your name alone is worth billions of dollars?" And he says, "Trust me, I know." And I said, okay, there was no real proof there, but he made these grand statements about his worth. Now, saying that to a reporter is one thing, but what's so interesting about this book is that you focus on something called SOFCs.
Yeah.
And that is so important in this story in understanding how you, as an investigator, as a lawyer, looked at his financial statements and saw possible crime.
Sure. The SOFC's statements of financial condition. And we had the benefit of a lot of fact-finding that had been done by the New York State Attorney General, Letitia James, and the facts that she found ultimately found their way into a civil complaint that she filed, which is over 200 pages long and chock full of evidence relating to these financial statements. But what we discovered was that Trump had prepared an annual financial statement because they had to be supplied to banks under loan covenants. And for some loans, the banks were willing to make loans based on personal guarantees. But if they were going to get Trump's personal guarantee, they wanted a personal financial statement. And that's common banking practice in the private wealth management industry and sections of the bank where he did business, primarily with Deutsche Bank, I'm talking about in the years in question. So Trump had to provide annual financial statements. Under bank policy, they were not, by the way, to include any value attached to brand value. Trump did get a letter from a branding company that he would wave around, and I guess at one point he waved it in front of you, that indicated that his personal brand, the value of his name, was, I think, $3 or $3.5 billion. And one of the interesting little factoids we discovered was that there was no date on that letter. And I spoke to Michael Cohen at one point about the letter, and Cohen explained there's no date on the letter because he wants to be able to use the letter whenever he wants to, under whatever circumstances he wants to, and there's no need to bring it current. It's an evergreen brand letter that gives him $3.5 billion to tack onto his financial statements for political purposes and so on. For banks, you can't use brand value, and they didn't attribute much meaning to a letter that says, and here's another $3.5 billion. They wanted regular financial statements prepared by an outside accounting firm, and that's what they got. The problem was when the accounting firm put out the financial statements on its letterhead, it did so on the basis of representations and warranties they got from Donald Trump and the Trump organization that the numbers were compiled, with some exceptions, pursuant to generally accepted accounting principles, and that no information was withheld from the auditors, and that the numbers that were provided fairly presented Trump's financial statements. All of those statements were provided. Trump signed guarantees at the bank, signed representations and compliance certificates vouching for the accuracy of the financial statements, but the financial statements were phony, for want of a better word.
What was your aha moment as an investigator where you said to yourself, I see a case here?
It started with information received from the New York Attorney General's office, and this is the sequence of events is recounted in the book. And over the course of some time, it became apparent that it's not one asset or 1 year that's overstated, and the magnitude of the overstatement, depending on the asset, was massive. His triplex apartment was valued for several years at over $300 million on the basis of containing 30,000 square feet, except it didn't have 30,000 square feet. It had 11,000 square feet. He told people that it had 30,000 square feet, and we had testimony from a reporter who indeed had been told directly by Donald Trump that the apartment had 33,000 square feet. But that's one value for one asset, and the financial statements were permeated by that kind of deception. But an aha moment came early on when we were speaking to Michael Cohen about the financial statements, and Michael Cohen was the first one to float the notion that the financial statements had been falsified when he testified before the House Oversight Committee. And what Cohen told us when we spoke to him was that that he had been in conversations directly with Trump and Weisselberg in which Trump set the net worth that he wanted to have for whatever reason. He decided on the net worth, and then the values of the assets that made up the net worth were decided upon in order to reach the target figure that Trump had given for the net worth. So the values for the assets were reverse engineered according to the net worth target, which is not really the way you're supposed to do it. You know, your net
What's
worth.
the crime there? Is it fraud? If you had moved forward with an indictment on that front, what would the charge be?
The crime would have been filing false business instruments. The financial statement and other crimes. It is a crime under New York law, although a misdemeanor, to utter a false financial statement. It becomes a felony when documents are falsified for the purpose of committing another crime. And here the documents were given to the bank. They became business records of the bank. The certifications were accompanied by the financial statements, and so the certifications were given to the bank with the intent of committing or concealing the crime of uttering false financial statements. And there are other permutations, but it's essentially the crime was you can't lie to a bank to get loans.
And this isn't the only crime you're investigating. You mentioned Michael Cohen, the longtime Trump advisor, kind of the fixer/lawyer in Trump's orbit. You call it the zombie case in the book. Explain that, while you were looking into the financial statements, you're also investigating the so-called zombie case and the role of Michael Cohen.
Sure. The zombie case, we called it at times the zombie case because it was a theory of prosecution and some potential crimes that were investigated, put aside because of legal or factual problems, reinvestigated, so they were exhumed, and put aside for a variety of reasons, re-examined yet again, and it kept returning from the grave so often that we started referring to it as the zombie theory. And what it involved was the concealment of the reimbursement to Michael Cohen of the hush money that he had paid to Stormy Daniels. Most people who have followed the Trump saga recall that it became public years ago that Michael Cohen, on Trump's behalf, had paid $130,000 to Stormy Daniels and her lawyer right before the election in 2016, and at a time when she was threatening to expose her allegation that she had had an affair with Donald Trump. That was...
I don't mean to interrupt.
Sure.
But let's pause. You used the word threat. That's key to understanding your perception of the zombie case, because you believe Trump was being threatened by Stormy Daniels, then the payment was in some way money laundering.
Well, the first thing I looked at when I looked at these facts shortly after starting working on the case was what other crimes might be involved in the payment of the hush money and the disguise of the reimbursement, because the reimbursement took place in a disguised fashion. If Michael Cohen had gotten, first of all, I'll back up once. So I apologize for a little bit of legal background here, but it's not a crime to pay hush money. And it's not a crime to get reimbursed for paying hush money if you're the payer's lawyer. If Michael Cohen had received from Donald Trump a check that said in payment, in reimbursement for the hush money, that would have changed the whole legal landscape. But that's not what happened. The reimbursement to Cohen was disguised. Cohen got a home equity loan. He paid the money after getting a home equity loan. He then got reimbursed over a 12-month period during 2017, while Donald Trump was in the White House, at times receiving the reimbursement checks from Trump in the Oval Office of the White House. And he got the checks from Trump as they were fashioned as payment of monthly legal expenses pursuant to retainer agreement. Except there was no retainer agreement, there were no legal expenses, and the bookkeeping, the documentation in the company's records was false. So again, another instance of creating false business records. But that crime under New York law is a misdemeanor, unless it's committed with the intent to conceal, unless there's an intention to commit or conceal another crime. So we had to look for another crime. One of the other crimes we looked at was, well, might it be money laundering? To be money laundering, money has to be the proceeds of illegal activity. And we started looking at, well, maybe when the money was paid to Stormy Daniels and her lawyer, it was already criminal proceeds because maybe it was the proceeds of an extortion. For legal reasons, that theory just didn't pan out. And we were left with a case where we could bring misdemeanor charges for falsifying the business records, and maybe, and it raised a new issue of law, maybe a felony if the expenses, if the business records were created with the intent to conceal the federal election law violation to which Michael Cohen pleaded guilty arising out of the payment to Stormy Daniels. But without getting into all of the gnarly details and legal issues, whether that federal crime counts under state law, under New York state law, to make the misdemeanors a felony is an open question. And so it created the risk that if we charge the case, the charges will be reduced to a felony. When we first looked at this, we were investigating 7 other felonies. We didn't think at that early point that the right thing to do was to charge a bunch of crimes that might be reduced to a misdemeanor. We later decided we would join those charges with the other more serious felony charges that we developed growing out of the financial statements. It's a bit laborious.
No, so you're humming along, you're working in the Manhattan DA office, and you have an open question about how exactly to formulate an indictment, but you're moving toward it. And then as the book documents, Cyrus Vance, the Manhattan district attorney, decides to leave. Your world is upended as an investigator. As you write in the book, a new district attorney ultimately comes in, Alvin Bragg. Things seem to fall apart in terms of your view of it.
Yes. And let me comment on some of the way stations that you mentioned. Cy Vance's tenure ended at the end of 2021. We knew as early as March of that year, his tenure ended at the end of the year. We knew as early as mid-March that he was not going to be running for re-election. Many people have asked, well, why didn't you just hurry up and charge the case while Cy Vance was DA, and then you wouldn't have to deal with whatever the views might be of an incoming administration? And the short answer to that question is we were working as fast and as hard as we could. We got the accounting records that became the basis for the potential prosecution toward the end of February 2021. By the end of June 2021, we had charged the Trump Organization and Alan Weisselberg with tax offenses relating to Weisselberg's free apartment, free cars, tuition for his grandchildren, and so on. That took some time. We then plunged into the financial statements, and as I describe in the book, that was no small task. It was like boiling the ocean, which was a phrase that one of my colleagues used, because you're dealing with years of financial statements, dozens of assets, and the method of valuation changed from asset to asset and year to year. So understanding the complexities of the financial statements took months. And as we got toward the end of Cy Vance's tenure, by this point, I should say, I was working nights, weekends, holidays, and many people on the team were working very hard. The question is, are we going to be able to get it done? There's no doubt that Cy Vance wanted to make the decision and would have liked to have seen charges, if charges were appropriate, during his tenure. You know, I've seen written that Cy just dragged his feet so that the case wouldn't be made and he could pass the buck on to his successor. It just couldn't be further from the truth. We just couldn't get it done. We finally reached the point where we thought we were in a position to make a charging decision and to move forward with the work that's necessary to return charges, work in the grand jury, drafting the indictment, and so on, right around the end of 2021. And then a new district attorney arrived. And foolishly, perhaps, in retrospect, as we were working along at the end of 2021, we did not foresee, I certainly did not foresee, that the change of administration would slow us down, would prevent the case from moving forward. And I don't think, from the conversations we had, that Cy Vance thought that that was going to happen. We all understood, of course, that the new regime would have to vet the case. It would happen on the watch of the new district attorney, and the new district attorney would have to make the decision that he was comfortable with the case and proceed. And it didn't quite happen the way we hoped or anticipated.
And you resigned eventually.
Eventually, after it became clear that the district attorney was not going to authorize the prosecution on the record we had developed.
Mark, here's what District Attorney Bragg has said on the record in recent days. Quote, this is a quote to reporters. "We have an active, ongoing investigation, so I'm constrained from what I can say. But here's what I can say. I bring hard cases when they are ready. I came to the same conclusion that multiple senior prosecutors in my office independently came to, and that was that Mark Pomerantz's case simply was not ready." End quote. Your response?
Well, I think it was ready, but apart from that dispute, which is a fact about which nobody should really care, what you should care about is that it has been a year since that time. If the case wasn't ready in January 2022, here we are in February 2023. What's been done to make the case ready? When is it going to be ready? And
do you believe the Manhattan District Attorney's Office will ever indict Trump?
I am I'm loath to predict. First of all, I haven't been in the office for a year. I can't speak for the Manhattan DA. It'd be a little bit unfair to try and do that. I'd be personally surprised if the financial statement case were indicted, because I just haven't seen from the public reporting the kind of forward motion and investigative steps that one might expect if that case were getting ready to indict. But the zombie case, the payment of the reimbursement of the hush money payment through false business records, that case may well get made. It's certainly one that in the last month there's been a lot of press about what the Manhattan District Attorney has been doing and the new efforts that have been made. Michael Cohen has been in to meet with
He keeps showing up on television with Lanny Davis at his side.
Don't get between Michael Cohen and a camera. But having said that, when it came to describing the circumstances that we were investigating, look, Michael was cooperative. He's a peculiar cooperating witness because he didn't have a sword hanging over his head. He had been prosecuted, convicted, served his time. He was cooperating. I'm not going to speak for his motives. That requires a degree that I don't have. But he was cooperating without the customary expectation of leniency that most cooperators have.
As a longtime observer of Michael Cohen as a reporter, I would venture, based on my reporting, if you have seen Michael Cohen and Donald Trump interact up close, you're not surprised about the cooperation. I'll leave it at that. Final question before we get to the Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question, please line up and make sure you ask it in the microphone, which is over here. But before we get to the Q&A, you can start lining up if you would like. You say something very interesting in the book. Quote, nevertheless, the feds have not gone near Trump's financial statements or his tax returns. And that really put a red flag in front of me as I read the book, because I've been spending a lot of time reporting on the grand juries and Trump and the federal investigation of Trump. And you're right. It appears the financial aspect of the Trump organization is not part of the scope of their inquiry, based at least on what we know so far. What can you tell us about that decision on the federal level as a former federal prosecutor?
I really can't shed much light on that. I describe in the book the reasons, both relating to the substantive law, procedural law, federal resources, the reasons why an investigation like the one we were doing would be vastly easier if it was being conducted under the auspices of the Department of Justice. The statutes are better, the procedure is better, the punishment is greater, the resources are greater. We were doing it because somebody had to do it. Why the feds didn't undertake that investigation, at least once Donald Trump was no longer president of the United States, I don't know. Now, before he lost the re-election, one could say, I suppose, why carry forward with the investigation? Under Department of Justice policy, he cannot be indicted as a sitting president. I'm not sure that that explains the lack of an investigation. The Manhattan DA was investigating Donald Trump when he was the sitting president, trying to, and had all the litigation, and continued to investigate and would have had the same issues, I think, trying to bring a criminal case against the sitting president as the DOJ had. But why the investigation didn't get jump-started on the federal level, at least once Trump lost the election, was no longer president, I don't know. It's possible, I suppose, that the feds were deferring to the work that was being done by the Manhattan DA and the state attorney general. But if the feds want to do something, they don't usually wait for state authorities to finish. It really works the other way. So I just can't answer that question. It's a question that's worth asking.
Does anyone have a question? You can line up at the microphone. As we wait for someone to come over and ask a question, I'll ask a question that's been raised since this book's been published. Let's say the Manhattan District Attorney's Office does move forward with an indictment. The microphone's over here. How would this book complicate such an indictment, if at all?
Sure. Look, I thought a lot about that as I was writing the book and deciding whether to write the book. I think you can sense from the tenor of the book and perhaps my remarks, I did not want to do anything that would mess up a potential prosecution of Donald Trump. And I became satisfied that I wouldn't, because the facts underlying any potential prosecution, whether it's the zombie case or the financial statement case, are out there in the public domain. The facts relating to the Stormy Daniels hush money payments and their reimbursement have been in the public domain for, I think, at least 3 or 4 years. Michael Cohen described them in his book. Stormy Daniels described them in her book. Then she went on Michael Cohen's podcast and spoke about it. Those facts became public in the federal prosecution of Michael Cohen and in the reporting that was done by many people. And there were no secrets about that scenario that are contained in the book. I brought the facts together, but it's not a circumstance where I was letting cats out of the bag. The cats were running free for quite some time. On the financial statement side, Letitia James, in her civil complaint against Donald Trump, based on the preparation of false financial statements, laid out in chapter and verse, in literally hundreds of pages, the details of why the financial statements were false, how they had been used with banks and insurance companies and other recipients. And indeed, she said, here are the crimes that were committed. And those were the crimes we intended to bring. So the case we had was out there and public before my book, months before my book was published.
Seems to me that Trump is getting away. Everybody is taking so long to get him. Did he have any influence on the district attorney or the other prosecutors? I don't understand. Is it just that because he was president, we're going to drag this out? I mean, if you look back at Mueller's investigation, he did a thorough investigation. He laid out possible obstruction of justice charges. Then he surprises us with saying, well, we can't indict the president, which he should have said at the beginning. Sold less papers, maybe. But why, when they came in, excuse me, Merrick Garland came in, or anybody, why didn't they prosecute him for those obstruction of justice charges? They seem to let everything just go on by.
Look, one of the points I tried to talk about in the book was that one of the things that may happen that I thought deserved to be discussed, because I don't think it should be happening, is that when it comes to Donald Trump, there's a desire to have a perfect case, to not pull the trigger if there's any real shot of losing the case, not to act until the circumstances virtually compel you to act. And if that's the course that prosecutors follow, you wind up, in effect, with a different system of justice for Donald Trump than you do, as I call him in the book, Joe Blow from Kokomo. Somebody else on these same facts, who wasn't the former president of the United States, would have been indicted, in my view, very, very quickly. And, you know, you hear the expression that you don't shoot for the king unless you're sure you can kill the king.
Wow.
What's wrong with that, in my view, among other things, is that when you're dealing with a would-be king, if you don't take your shot when you can, you're going to wind up with a monarchy and not a democracy. So one of the reasons I wrote the book was to try and encourage discussion about how prosecutors ought to deal with cases like this. You have to, in my judgment, move quickly and decisively. That doesn't mean you're not careful, right? You're supposed to be careful when you charge anybody with a crime. But what it does mean is that you can't allow the concern for the repercussions or the concern about nailing down a certain victory to paralyze you.
What would have you
We,
felt?
we get a question from someone else, if you don't mind.
No, I mind. But
Oh, just trying to be fair.
Thank you, sir. I have concerns about the criminalization of the political process. And so I guess my standard would be if your motivation for starting a prosecution or starting an investigation is political, you shouldn't do it. But I'm just thinking out loud here, but did you think about that, and did you think you met that test? Thank you.
And that's another topic that I try to talk about at some length in the book. I do agree that the criminal justice system should not be politicized. You don't, as a prosecutor, you don't bring political cases because you want to serve a political end. They're not supposed to be acts of political warfare. Having said that, I'm now speaking, obviously, as a private citizen, exercising my First Amendment rights. I'm no longer speaking for the government. I can conclude, as a matter of my own political beliefs, that it's important for prosecutors to act when they have legitimate cases, when they can bring their cases with adequate evidence under all the procedures that we have in place to act fairly and legally. And that's not inconsistent with prosecutors keeping politics aside. And I can tell you, as we had our huddles in the Manhattan DA's office, there was not a moment that Donald Trump's politics came into the discussion. We were talking about evidence, we were talking about law, we were talking about witnesses, we were talking about where to go next in the investigation. There wasn't a moment when, even in a private conversation, people said, you know, we really have to get this guy, because it's just not what prosecutors are supposed to do, and we all knew that, and just didn't happen.
Sorry, thank you so much for speaking out. I think one of the things that as someone else has said, I haven't understood enough is, I think it's extremely important that you come and speak out, because the public, we see the obstruction of justice, nothing happening. We see the fact that Mueller didn't really investigate, doesn't seem the financial aspect of some of the ties of Trump to Russia. And then we have, I'm interested in your comment on the more recent indictment of the counterintelligence officer or head of counterintelligence SDNY, who was also linked to Deripaska. And I've been sort of surprised there hasn't been, I was shocked actually that there was not more press coverage of this. Because this is, when you start to connect, and you said dropping, I love the expression of dancing through the raindrops of accountability. It's perfect. But, unless we start to get some answers to these things, and unless the press, I'm going to speak to you now as well, starts really asking these questions.
I am all the press right here.
I know, but starts asking these questions, because we seem to keep getting distracted by this idea that there's politicization of DOJ and everything else, when that's just not been borne out by the facts. In fact, it's been quite the opposite. It's been, as you said, a lack of action because of this fear. Otherwise, there would be more explanation about what has happened, why hasn't anything happened. So people see it. I think it's extremely important to speak out, and I wanted to thank you for that, but I also wanted to get your perspective on that recent indictment, and why hasn't it been covered more in the press?
On the second part, I really can't help you. On the first part, thank you for your comment. I will just say it's not easy. I knew when I wrote this book that I would get attacked. I knew that it broke norms. I knew that that it's not something former prosecutors do. You don't tell tales out of school. You don't talk about what happens behind closed doors. You don't talk about evidence that has not been included in a charging instrument. And part of the reason I did that is because of a personal view and those are good policies, and I followed those policies for my entire career. The reason I decided to do something different here, frankly, relates to something that I read in Robert Costa's book, Peril. The last 2 words of the book, which resonated with me, was peril remains. And it is my personal view that Donald Trump, unlike virtually any other, perhaps any other criminal target of a criminal investigation, represents an existential threat to the rule of law. And if you are dealing with an existential...
Thank you for speaking out, honestly.
If you are dealing with an existential threat to the rule of law, there is an argument and perhaps even an obligation to put aside the usual prudential practices, the norms. Now, I didn't break the law by writing the book. I wasn't going to do that. But when it came to violating norms, when it came to talking about things that prosecutors don't talk about, I thought in these truly extraordinary circumstances, it was the right thing to do. And that's why I did it.
Thank you.
Hello. To piggyback on what you were just saying about DOJ policies regarding speaking out, and I appreciate an insider's perspective and a true speaker as much as anyone except for maybe Bob.
Are you kidding? Reporters like it when people speak out.
And I'm certainly looking forward to a Trump
If
indictment.
you want to leak to me after this event, come this way.
And I'm certainly looking forward to a Trump indictment as much as anybody. But it's one thing for Stormy Daniels and Michael Cohen to speak out publicly. It seems a little different, even though you're a private citizen, that you had access to non-public information previously. Do you think that this opens a new avenue to a potential Trump defense and an inevitable prosecution? Do you think that he'll single out your book as a way to protect himself?
Look, he may talk about my book, but the question becomes, legally and ethically, whether talking about these things in the book made it substantially more difficult for him to get a fair trial if he's indicted and if there is a prosecution. Bearing in mind that when I wrote the book, there was no prosecution and there still is no prosecution. But should there be a prosecution and the issue is raised, does the book somehow make prosecution of him more difficult? I have to say, given literally the oceans of ink that have been spilled about Donald Trump over the last number of years, given the thousands of hours that have been spent on every network everywhere in the world talking about Donald Trump, to me, the notion that of all the stories that have been written and all the segments on TV, it's my book that's going to make it difficult for him to get a fair trial. I just don't think there's any substance to that. I'm confident. Look, I hope a lot of people will buy the book. But I am confident that a year from whenever he's, who knows if he'll be indicted, when he'll be indicted, or when he'll be tried. But I'm confident that if that day should come, the judge will be able to find 12 jurors who have not read my book.
Let's pause for a second and look at Trump's statement in response to your book. Trump's statement brings up this point, and it does raise the question about the use of Michael Cohen as a key witness. Here's Trump's statement in part. Wow, Donald Trump's quote here. Wow, the book just put out by Crooked Hillary's attorney, Mark Pomerantz, is turning out to be a hit on the district attorney in the weak case with many fatal flaws. Prosecutors in the DA's office actually quit in protest, and because they thought it was irresponsible and very unfair to President Trump. They also felt they didn't want to rely on a sleazebag, disbarred lawyer from hell like Michael Cohen as a witness. In other words, they thought the case was terrible, a loser. But put aside the phrasing of this particular statement, it raises the issue of Michael Cohen. Is that the reason Alvin Bragg, the district attorney right now, has had reservations about bringing the people versus Donald Trump?
That's impossible for me to say. One of the
You wrote a memo to him, though. You put the memo in the book.
yeah.
And tell us about the response to that.
I wrote several memos to him. One was perhaps inartfully phrased. I wrote it in lieu of a resignation letter on the morning I was going to the hospital for some surgery, and it clearly didn't sit well with the district attorney. I also wrote a memo urging him to consider, as he was considering whether to authorize the case, I wrote a memo urging him to consider that some cases need to be brought even where there is a substantial risk of loss, because if they are not brought, the public will not have confidence in the enforcement of the rule of law. And I believe that. I gave him an example from my career where we had done that, but we didn't have a final, closing sit-down where he shared the particular reasons why the case wasn't going to go forward. I've learned more from the statements in the media during the last week than I learned the entire time we were dealing with each other about what his thinking was or reservations might have been. Michael Cohen, what I hope to happen, and I was glad to see, if indeed the media reports are true, that Alvin Bragg sat down in person with Michael Cohen, because I don't know how you make an appraisal of somebody's credibility, of how they'll appear on the witness stand, whether they'll be convincing, without meeting the person and asking questions. One of the things that Cy Vance did during our investigation was sit in on grand jury testimony and sit in on witness interviews. And I can recall vividly a meeting that we had with Michael Cohen where we took him through the Stormy Daniels facts, and the reaction was, with proper preparation and with proper questioning, Michael Cohen can be a convincing witness. I believe that to be the case. I believe he was telling the truth about the matters we spoke with him about. And if indeed the district attorney now is meeting with him, I hope he makes his own appraisal and comes to the same judgment.
My question actually relates a little bit to what you just said, actually quite a bit, because it involves Michael Cohen. I haven't read your book, but based on, and I'm sure there's a lot more detail that you haven't covered in the book, but it sounded as though the only really truly incriminating statement that would have been shown Trump's responsibility was from Michael Cohen, where he said, I have to get the statements to match the bank's needs, because you're going to get accountants, you're going to get expert witnesses, on both sides that are going to say, oh yeah, this is all fine, this was nothing wrong, unless you get something beyond that. And you got it from Michael Cohen, who was, was there nobody else other than Michael Cohen who could rely on?
We had plenty beyond that. We would not have gone forward. I would not have wanted to go forward if the only evidence connecting Donald Trump to the falsification of the financial statements was Michael Cohen's testimony. Okay. But I get into some of it in the book. Some of it I couldn't get into because it was protected by grand jury by grand jury secrecy. But in my judgment, there was plenty of evidence that would tie Donald Trump to the preparation of the financial statements. And if you do buy the book, you can look at a paragraph on page 223 that talks about one of the things, some of the things I might have said to a jury if I were trying to convince a jury that Donald Trump was in fact responsible for these financial.
Well, I hope it's more than just 223. It should go on for a few pages,
No,
don't you
that,
think?
that was a summary
Oh,
paragraph.
okay.
So, in the final minute or two here, help us understand your perspective on all of the lingering investigations of former President Trump. There is the civil lawsuit in New York. There's the ongoing Manhattan District Attorney investigation. There's the January 6th, there's the congressional investigation. Georgia, Fani Willis, the district attorney in Fulton County, continuing to investigate the election. There's the records case of former President Trump and how he handled classified material. There's the grand jury on alternate electors and that scheme. There's a grand jury on January 6th and a possible conspiracy to overturn an election. When you look at that entire landscape, complicated for many people with busy lives to follow all of the ins and outs of all of these different investigations every day, even if you watch a lot of cable news and read a lot of books. You're a former federal prosecutor. You've been in the belly of the beast in the Manhattan DA. In your closing remarks here, help us, help our audience, and me too, understand what you see and what you're paying attention to right now.
I see, in terms of the DOJ, serious investigation. It's taking a long time, but from what one can see from the outside, which frankly is little when it comes to an investigation like this, it looks like a serious and substantial investigation. I think the people are acting in good faith. I have no reason certainly to question the bona fides of Merrick Garland or Jack Smith. And how it will end is impossible for me or anybody else to say who's not in the Department of Justice. Part of the reason, though, I wrote the book is to point out a number of things. First, it's difficult to do cases like this. One of the reasons it's difficult is because no matter what you do, you will be accused of making a political decision. If you act, it's an act of political warfare. If you don't act, it's an act of political warfare. And I've seen editorials urging prosecutors to stay their hand with respect to Donald Trump because indicting him would give him a platform, allow him to become a martyr, and we should just let him slink back, my words, under the rock from which he came. I have a problem with that because I don't think the political repercussions of a prosecution are what prosecutors ought to think about. What they ought to think about is, was a crime committed? Is the person guilty? They ought to think about whether the evidence is legally sufficient to establish guilt. They ought to think about whether they have a reasonable possibility of success if they go forward. They ought to weigh up the aggravating and mitigating circumstances because that's what we do. That's what I did for years in deciding on other cases. That's how you have to approach Donald Trump, I believe. And I also believe, from what I know of the facts, basically from the public reporting, that if that's the analysis that is used, he will be charged.
Mark Pomerantz, author of People versus Donald Trump, former federal prosecutor, former special assistant district attorney, New York County. Thank you very much for joining us here at Politics and Prose. Thank you to Politics and Prose and for everyone watching on C-SPAN. We appreciate it.